Hey everyone, thank you for joining me today from wherever you're joining me from. And welcome to the Boosting Fintech API Revenues webinar. I'm glad you could make it. And my name's Sid Maestre, VP Developer Relations at APImatic. And we offer a developer experience platform to companies looking to accelerate API adoption and the returns from their API programs. Prior to joining APImatic, I led the efforts to automate the developer experience at companies like Xero, the cloud accounting platform, and Lob, a direct mail API company. And I'd like to start today by asking a question to the audience. What do these bullet points have in common? If you look at them, new developer signups, total active developers, API keys generated, time to first API call, or just generally developer engagement. Well, these are things that companies use to measure their API programs. And there's nothing wrong with these metrics. They tell us how we're attracting, onboarding, and growing our API users. But through conversations with several fintechs, I think we need to add an additional metric that's pretty important, which is time to value. The time it takes between making that first API call and making that first production grade API call, where some value is being derived by the fintech and the API provider. And that was actually the thesis for the talk that I did at Finovate in the spring, which is that fintechs realize value when data flows through their APIs, which prompts the question, why does it take so long to get the data actually flowing? Why does it take months and months for developers to build these integrations? Well, it's not because the developers are lazy or taking long vacations. It's because there's so much code that they actually need to write to build a production grade integration. And so today, our goal is to equip you with the strategies to boost the ROI from your API programs. Now, reducing that time to integrate is one of the drivers for that revenue, but also reducing the amount of support and hand-holding that you have to do through that integration process. You might have whole teams that are dedicated to this, which is very resource intensive. And how can we deliver this code to developers that they need without having to hire tons of engineers and all the associated costs that's going to impact the bottom line for your API programs? So we're going to look at trying to solve those solutions today. And the core of it is giving developers the code that they need to integrate and doing it in a self-service way. So before we dive into that, the framework we're going to look at is the obstacles that developers encounter along that way towards a seamless integration, and how can we clear away those obstacles. So like I said, reducing the amount of code that developers have to write, you're going to see returns sooner and you're going to be able to stay competitive. So the three obstacles. The first one is API complexity. Now, what do I mean by API complexity? It can come in several forms. For a lot of fintechs, there's a higher level of security requirement that goes beyond your standard APIs. There can be unfamiliar financial concepts. There can be inconsistencies in defining how endpoints and parameters and requests are created. And those inconsistencies often arise because at larger fintechs and banks and other fintech institutions, you've got multiple teams exposing APIs. And sometimes through acquisition, you have multiple companies coming together and trying to merge all their different APIs, which end up resulting in different standards and inconsistencies that are confusing for developers. Also, there can be complex data formats like multi-part binary files and things like that that are just more difficult depending on the language developers are creating their integrations with. So that's number one. Reducing is that API complexity. That's obstacle one. Obstacle two is documentation inaccuracies. When you take those tasks of creating developer documentation and other parts of your developer experience across a product manager, engineering teams, perhaps technical writers, developer advocates, maybe support teams, even across multiple departments, you may end up with a lot of manual processes that can introduce human error, and just the coordination across all these teams can be challenging. And that has an impact that ripples across your whole developer experience. So inaccuracies is a real problem, because if developers are finding out-of-date information or key information is missing, they're going to be confused, and it's going to cause the developer to have doubts, and you'll lose some credibility with that audience. So we want to reduce those. And then the third thing is incomplete developer experiences, what I call deficiencies in the overall developer experience that we provide. Now, when we're starting with a brand new API, an API reference guide is usually the first thing that we want to build and create for developers. And those are, when it's a small brand new API, that's not too difficult. We might even offer a Postman collection. We may get to the point that we have some generic code samples in one or more languages. And essentially, if we stop there, then there's a whole piece that we're missing from our developer experience that leaves developers to have to translate that API reference, which is, REST. It's language agnostic. They have to translate that into their language, whether it's Java or Python or C#, whatever language it is, they're having to do that translation. So those are the three obstacles. How do we overcome these obstacles? Well, when it comes to reducing complexity, specifically for fintechs, which is, as I mentioned, quite often larger organizations with a lot of APIs being built over a period of time, potentially by multiple teams or multiple companies that have merged. One of the key ways that I've learned through conversations with large fintechs that APImatic works with is good API governance. So you can reduce complexity by having those guidelines and consistency across your APIs. And as APIs change or new APIs are introduced, the internal developers know how they should be designing the APIs according to the standards and policies that you've established. API governance also involves when you onboard new developers onto one of your internal teams, that they're provided the tools and the guidelines so that they know what the standards are internally. And as new issues arise with your API design, having some sort of established working group or committee that can address any of those questions about how do we handle deprecation? How do we handle pagination in our API? That's not something that a single person can often decide. It's often input from multiple places within your organization. So having that working group is key. And it should be used as a reference when you are reviewing the API design and implementation by the engineering team. How else can we address complexity? Well, we can hide complexity, which is actually a pretty interesting approach. If you think about those generic code samples that we might give a developer, quite often it's very basic. It doesn't do anything to hide the REST implementation. So if a developer has to write all the code from scratch or use some generic code sample, they're having to review your documentation in depth. They have to set up their own development environment, go and figure out what HTTP client they want to use, figure out how to authenticate, maybe go find an OAuth 2 library and see if they can understand how to use it. They have to build out each API request. They have to figure out how to deserialize JSON into their native objects in their language, handle exceptions, log errors, handle rate limits, retries. If you have a token that expires, how do I refresh that token or know that my token's valid before trying to make an API call? There's just a lot of work. And what you can do is you can actually hide all of that complexity by having an interface that's simplified. And that's the column on the right, the bullet points there. If you provide a library or an SDK to your developers, what you've done is you've created a foundation where you could build a getting started experience where they install an SDK, they configure some API keys, and then potentially have some code that they can copy, paste, and then run to make that first API call. But the best part is that first API call is written with code that they could then use in their production grade integration. So it's really great foundation. And that leads me to the third way to reduce complexity, which is with a foundation of an SDK or library, you provide developers with an IDE experience that includes code hinting, code completion, inline documentation, so the developer can get into a state of flow as they're writing their code, building that integration faster. All of the code samples you give are copy, paste, run for each endpoint. And with the code samples for each endpoint, you could actually build guides on top of that. So this is also very common with fintechs. How do I solve a complex use case? For example, payments. I need to authorize, capture, and in some cases, perform a refund if there was a problem with my transaction or the customer decides to request a refund. What are the API calls that I need to make in succession? How do I chain them together to create an outcome that I'm looking for? And guides are a way to do that. And then at the top of our, it's not quite a pyramid, but at the top of our stack is AI. So developers are gravitating towards using AI to help them write code. There are still challenges where not the same code isn't returned to each developer, so there can be variation in code, and there can be hallucinations where sometimes the AI will make up an endpoint or make up things that don't exist in an API. So having some sort of copilot that you can trust that is perhaps trained on the SDK that you've created, that's going to be more deterministic and it's going to have less chance for hallucination. So those are the ways that you can address API complexity. I'm sure there's other ways, but those are the ones that come to mind for me. The second obstacle I talked about was inaccuracies in our documentation. So how can we solve this? Well, I mentioned having a lot of different teams contributing, having manual processes that are error prone. And I feel that if we can remove those manual steps, if we can establish a workflow for our API changes, we can start to automate things. And that automation will increase the accuracy of our documentation and other artifacts that we might generate. Now, in previous roles, I've leveraged OpenAPI definitions to act as a source of truth. And with that, I was able to use other linting tools and validation tools to enforce the style guides that I'd established, as well as add contract testing to make sure that my OpenAPI definition and my live API are actually in sync, because there's nothing more frustrating for a developer than to look at the documentation and try to hit your live API and realize that the request or the response payloads have changed in some small way that breaks their code, and they have to spend an hour or more trying to debug and figure out what's broken or what's changed. Having this automation means that when your API changes, everything else can be regenerated and automatically updated for you. There's also a move towards automation in generation of code samples, as well as those idiomatic SDKs in multiple languages. And you can imagine the size of the team that you would need to do all of that work manually. And then the third obstacle I talked about was deficiencies in our developer experience. So what we want to really strive for is to have a comprehensive DX. And I've been talking to folks about this for the past year or so, and I've come up with these 4 stages of the developer journey as a way to sort of understand how the developer experience we offer slots into those 4 stages. So at stage 1 is discovery. The developers just landed on your dev portal, and they're trying to figure out, well, what can I do with this API? So at that stage, you're going to want to offer something like your API reference, right? That's sort of the table stakes. You have to have that. You might have some curl commands that a developer can copy and paste into their terminal and experience your API maybe. And there's also authentication, because without your API keys or an understanding of how to authenticate, you're never going to get that successful first API call. And I also would strongly recommend some explanation at a high level of what problems does your API solve. I know some companies skip right over this, but the best fintechs and the best API companies make sure that it's clearly communicated to technical and non-technical folks what your API can do for them. It's really important. Once they've bought into your solution, they actually want to get hands-on and evaluate your APIs. So for that, you might want to provide a getting started guide. You might want to have some kind of interactive API explorer or a Postman collection, so they can, again, non-technical people can start to experience your API. Or you might have those generic code samples. This is typically what a lot of companies do. And like I said, this is where they often stop and they think the developer experience is done. But we're forgetting stages 3 and 4. And the best companies like Stripe, really understand the power of offering libraries and SDKs. This quote is directly from their documentation that they say starting with their SDKs, it helps reduce the amount of boilerplate code that developers have to write. And so for me, when you get to stage 3, you're moving from that first Hello World API call to a production grade integration. If you want to reduce the time and start to see those transactions flowing, you need to provide more, provide that code developers need. So SDK libraries in multiple languages that your developers use, reference guides to go along with them, those runnable code samples for every endpoint, guided walkthroughs to show how to use those code samples together, and if possible, that AI assistance as part of your developer experience is a really powerful combination to accelerate that integration time. But we don't want to forget stage 4. And this, I think, is where automation is so important. Because if you build everything up to stage 3 and you launch it to the world, that's not the end. That's just the beginning of building and offering your developer experience. You need to be able to deliver updates to those libraries, to all of those developers. And using popular package managers like NPM, Maven, NuGet, it's a great way to keep the developers up to date with your API changes without requiring them to have to rewrite their integrations. You can make the changes to your libraries and then actually push those changes to your developers. And then I also mentioned automation through open API tools. You can really keep those improvement costs down by having an automation in place with a single source of truth. So when your API changes, you only have to update your API definition and then regenerate all of the parts of your developer experience. Now, I've been talking a lot today about these obstacles and friction points and how we can overcome them. But I thought it would help to show you an example of a company that's doing that today, which is a company called Maxio. You might know them by their former name, Chargeify. They're a subscription billing platform for SaaS companies, and they're a customer of API-Matics. So let me jump over to that tab and show you Maxio's developer portal. This was all created with API-Matic. It's a combination of generated documentation and handwritten documentation, so you can mix and match both of those. So this first page kind of talks about their different solutions, as well as their SDKs and kind of like what the different subscription, billing, management, all these different things that you might want to do. They've got their Getting Started guide that explains how to sign up and get your authentication credentials. They've got that narrative that explains authentication to a brand new developer. Here are those curl commands that I talked about in stage 1 of the developer journey. And if I scroll down a little bit, I can see my API endpoints. And I can come in here and I can see all the different API endpoints and click on any of these. And by default, I get my nice curl command here. Now, I've already set my API keys, but if I was a brand new developer, I could come in and put my API key in there, and I could configure it with my subdomain, which I need to have for Maxio to work properly. So if I come in here, I could just hit try it out, and it's going to go and get me a list of customers and show me the response right here in my documentation. So stage 1 is complete. We're starting to get into stage 2. I'm starting to experience the API. What if I want a Postman collection? Well, I can come here and I can click and I can download a Postman collection. I can get my API, get the API spec itself, or other formats like Insomnia, which is similar to Postman. So at that point, you've provided the curl commands. You provided a way to interact with the API, evaluate it. Now, if I stop my developer experience here, that would leave a lot of work for the Java developers, the .NET, the PHP developers. They'd have to translate all of this curl command and all this documentation. I'd have to somehow figure out how do I do this in my language. But with API-Matic, I've actually got all the different languages here. And when I click on one of these, the whole portal pivots around it. And now my code samples have gone from curl to Java. And it even has a nice feature here where I can show the complete file, and I get all the import statements, and I get a fully runnable piece of code sample right here to get a list of my customers. Let me put it back there. So that's the condensed version, so it's more readable. And now I'm getting into that stage 3. I need to build my production level integration. So if I'm a Java developer, I'll click Get SDK. I can click on how to set up my SDK, and it gives me instructions on how to install the package inside of my project. And if I scroll down, it explains more about how do I initialize my API client, explains where do I put my API keys and things like that. And if I wanted to, I could set up my project, go and copy and paste those code samples and start exploring and building my integration. But if Maxio knows some of the things I'm going to want to do, they can actually offer guided walkthroughs. So let me show you those real quick. I'll click on Product Catalog. And here it explains, what is a product family, kind of gives the details, what is a product, and it gives me a series of steps that I can follow. So I'll click Next, and I'm going to set up my API key again real quick in here. So I'll come in and I'll set up my API key. And I also need my subdomain. And let me go down there, paste that. There we go. And now I'm actually going to do a few steps here. Now I need to know that I've already created something called basic. So I'm going to call it basic 456. And I'm going to go ahead and try that out. And there we go. I just created a brand new product family called basic product family. And I'll say, let's go next step. And now I'm going to create a product, and you'll see that the product family ID is populated from step number 1. And if I want to, I can come in here and I can see that I'm going to create a new product called Gold Plan. Let's call it Gold Plan 456, and let's go ahead and try this out. Oh, it says my API handle has to be unique. Gold's been taken. Okay, so I just learned how the errors are being returned to me. So I'll just go back here and I'm going to say gold 456, and I'm going to go ahead and try that out. And boom, I just created my new product, and I can go next, and I can go the next step. So that's, as you can see, that's kind of how the process go with these getting started guides. But what about AI assistance? You could send developers off to ChatGPT or something and just hope that they're going to get accurate code back. Or you could actually build, or you could actually include some sort of chatbot inside your developer portal. And that's what API-Matic's doing for Maxio here. I can ask it one of these predefined questions like, tell me about the authentication for this API. And it's going to think for a second. And then it kind of gives me, explains, how basic authentication works and gives me more information about that. Let's go ahead and clear that. And we also have some of these predefined ones, like how do I create a product under a product family that doesn't exist? Now, this is a little more complex because it's generating some code here. So it's going to actually generate all the code for me in this window, and then it's going to explain to me what the code is going to do. So in addition to a narrative, it actually gives me all the code that I need to perform these 2 steps. So create a product family, and then get the response, and then create a product using that. But let's be realistic. Developers want to ask their own questions. So I came up with this one. Let's ask this. Can you create a new product family for my fitness challenge app? Then create a new challenge product called Beast Mode with 2 tiers, basic for $9 and premium for $29. Then create a new customer named Hulk Hogan and subscribe him to the premium plan. All right, well, it's quite complex. Let's see how our API Copilot handles this much more complex use case. Whew. All right, there it goes. Lots of code being generated here. So it's importing all of the libraries. This is all built around the SDKs that are generated by API-Matic. So the code's going to be accurate. That it's going to return the same response because the AI has been trained on this SDK and these code samples and the guided walkthroughs and all the documentation. And here's our explanation. Create a product family and product and price points. And let's go ahead and take a look at this code real quick. So, that is a lot of models we need to use, but that's good. It's all being created for me. I got my authentication. I created a new product family. I get that family ID. I create my Beast Mode product. I then take that product ID and I pass it in to create some price points for $9 for basic, $29 for premium. So now I've got those price points. And let's go ahead. They're creating Hulk Hogan. He's from Wrestling Incorporated. So my chatbot knows who Hulk Hogan is, which is pretty cool. And then it grabs that customer ID and it actually creates a subscription for him on our premium plan. So there's our premium price point ID being inserted right there. And so a developer can copy and paste this and have real coding assistance that's built around your API and the code that's generated specifically for your API. Now, the final question is this going to hallucinate? Is this going to start making up endpoints for me? So let me ask one more question. Can you create a subscription for the Stripe API? So now I'm going to ask it a question, not about Maxio's API, but about Stripe's API. I mean, I could ask it questions about the Golden Gate Bridge if I wanted to, but let's see what our chatbot says about this. And so you see, it didn't get confused and try and make up things about Stripe's API. It just used Maxio's subscription billing API, didn't use Stripe's because it hasn't been trained on that. It's actually dedicated to just Maxio's API endpoints. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize that. So that is just a demonstration of what's possible with the Open API tools that are available today. So in conclusion, I want to just reiterate the key takeaways from the webinar today, which is to boost your API revenue, you need to include the metric of time to value. How long does it take to go from hello world, that first API call, to actually production grade integrations? And the 3 ways to remove obstacles is for developers is to reduce complexity, minimize inaccuracies, and create a comprehensive developer experience. And you can do that and still see higher returns from your programs through automation. Open API is a great way to enable that automation and increase the accuracy of your documentation, your code samples, and the SDKs and libraries that you can present. And as I mentioned, AI is something developers are really looking for, and the future's here. API Copilot is a great way to include those sorts of AI enhancements to your developer experience. And I want to thank you for joining me today in the webinar. If you have any follow-up questions, please leave them in comments below. Happy to follow up with you and have a one-on-one conversation about the developer experience and how you can increase the returns from your API programs. Thanks for joining me today.